Hello everyone, I'm Erin Rogers and I'm the saxophonist with Hypercube. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about writing for the saxophone, specifically in the Hypercube paradigm. So while you probably already know a certain number of things about writing for the instrument, what I'm going to talk about today is mostly to do with the Hypercube quartet, writing for the instrument within the ensemble, and then I'll focus on some individual traits about the instrument. So the saxophone staff is usually at the top of your system. So typically you like to see saxophone, electric guitar, piano, percussion, or saxophone, electric guitar, percussion, then piano. I like to see saxophone at the top, and if it's somewhere else, it's a little bit harder to follow. So if you stick to that, that would be great. Saxophone is a transposing instrument. In this composition lab, you're going to have the opportunity to write for any of the four saxophones. I'd like you to consider any sort of instrument practicalities, such as switching quickly. If you do want two instruments in a piece, really be careful about how often you use it and try to make it as economical as possible. So, having the piece entirely, it's soprano saxophone, but then having tenor for two notes. Maybe think of other ways that pitch could come up in the ensemble, such as in the piano or the guitar. So those are some things to consider. There are four saxophones that I have. That starts with the soprano at the top of the range and goes to baritone at the bottom. Here are the various ranges of the saxophone. All saxophones are notated in the treble clef. Baritone has a lower written range because it has one more half step below the other saxophones, just in terms of how far it can reach, and that has to do with the physicality of the horn. It's just larger, so we have enough room to put an extra key on it. There is variation as to how high you can go on any of the four saxophones, and that is per player. My personal preference is top off with soprano sax around a G6 concert, A6 written, alto sax G6 concert, E7 written, tenor sax D6 concert, E7 written, bari sax G5 concert, E7 written. So those are just some general guidelines to follow when writing for me, for your piece for Hypercube. The general rule is just to check in with your player. So if you know the player you're going to write for, ask what they're comfortable playing on the higher range. And in general, all of the lower ranges are the same, though you will find some baritones with a low B flat and not a low A. When you're writing in the altissimo register, so anything above a written F sharp on the saxophone staff, be careful of a few things. One is to avoid writing altissimo lyrical lines. The pitches in the altissimo range are not as stable as the pitches in the main range of the horn, and so you risk losing a little bit of tone quality and fullness of tone, because the saxophonist is generally going to have to be a little more careful up there. Of course, this will vary from player to player too, but in general, just know there's a thinner quality to the pitches up there. A lot of times these altissimo notes are built on overtones, even though they have unique fingerings. They're thinner because they are just the thinner partials in general than the lower notes, which are full of many partials, especially the fundamentals. The other thing up there is it's not so easy to phrase lyrical melodies. If you're doing anything that's very foreground with the group, foreground saxophone, note that in the altissimo range, you might have a little bit more difficulty connecting some of the notes up there. Of course, the player will work towards whatever's needed, but having lyrical foreground melodies within the range of the saxophone is generally going to be more successful more often than not. Also, what I like to see, especially with the Hypercube group, just because of the varied instrumentation and the newness of this instrumentation, are some style pointers. So if you have a piece that you've sort of forged around a jazz combo, which isn't necessarily our forte with the group, but we do get pieces from time to time that are very much sort of capitalizing on this keyboard, guitar, drums, sax combo sound, which you find a lot in jazz rock, whatever. If that's the case, let us know what kind of style you're looking for in the music. So for me, the equipment might change. I might opt for a jazz mouthpiece, or I might use a harder reed if I know that you're really looking to dig into some of the louder low stuff. Any sort of style indicators you can give in your front matter telling us about the piece always really helpful. And that doesn't just pertain to the saxophone. That'll pertain to all the instruments. So be as forthcoming as you can with that information. Some of you have heard of vibrato. It's a sort of a stylistic and tone decoration. It's akin to the pedal of a piano. So there's a performance practice for it. And a lot of times performers choose when and how to use it. So at their own discretion, they might pedal this phrase or use a lot or a little bit of pedal. Where in vibrato for saxophone, it's also very much stylistically chosen. If the style of the music sounds like it, vibrato belongs, sort of as this sort of floral tonal decoration of a pitch, we will use that. But otherwise, we might choose to play without it. That said, if you can give any sort of indication of whether or not you want vibrato, of course that depends on whether or not you want vibrato and have made that decision. Just know if you don't make the decision to use vibrato or not, the performer will make that decision. And in a lot of new music, it'll be based around style. So unless you're writing very lyrical lines, I probably wouldn't use lyrical vibrato. So try to indicate it where needed. Let me just demonstrate a little bit for those of you who might not have heard classical sax vibrato. That is an example of me using vibrato at my discretion to help create phrases out of the line and to vary the speed and intensity dynamic of that vibrato to create the emphasis of the phrase that I want, the story I want to tell. If you say don't use vibrato, I'm going to play that. So there again, it's just a different way of decorating that line. Vibrato doesn't come up as often anymore as it used to. There's a certain era of music, sort of like I think French conservatory, mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century, where that was very much a thing. So there's also the opportunity to use vibrato as a technique. So there are examples of pieces where you'll see vibrato notated in terms of the speed and the wavelength, you could say. So here's an example of a variation of speed with vibrato. So you can hear the wavelength, and vibrato with saxophones is produced at the lip level. So whereas the flautist might use a diaphragm vibrato, the default with sax is to use it by basically pressuring the reed up and down. The idea of wavelength, so of I guess sort of like more pressure, less pressure up and down on that reed can also be a thing. So I think I had a little dynamic and speed variation there, but really what I was trying to show is this sort of wavelength change, wide to minuscule. Something to play with if you like. Those things can be notated very much like this. All right, another rule, if you can, please avoid using key signatures in the saxophone part. My preference is to play from the score, transposed score, and since the saxophone is the only transposing instrument in the Hypercube scenario, I'd like to see no key signature and accidentals throughout where needed. There are shortcuts for transposing on Finale and Sibelius and some of these notation programs where you checkbox transposing instrument and by default it puts a key signature in place. So I see a lot of pieces that have no connection whatsoever to the key of D major or A major, but I'm playing in a D major and an A major key signature with a bunch of accidentals that, you know, half the time cancel out. So that what that requires is for me to go through a piece that's very much atonal or very much in no key, and sort of redundantly erase a lot of these sharps. If you're writing in the concert pitch, instead of just clicking transposing instrument, the baritone, I'm going to want you to select the whole line, transpose up an octave and a major sixth, and then sweep through it to make sure that there aren't, you know, double flats, double sharps, and that all the keys move along in a way that's idiomatic. In that way, the same type of thing for the tenor saxophone. You're going to take your concert line, select it, transpose it up an octave and a major second. With the alto, select it, transpose it up a major sixth, and then with the soprano, select it, transpose it up a major second. And what that does is it just allows there to be no key signature, and each note is, you know, it's transposed, but it is a note that makes sense in my horizontal line as I'm playing it. So that's very much appreciated. Another rule of thumb, there's a lot of talk of circular breathing, and a lot of saxophonists circular breathe. Don't assume every saxophonist can, though. There are various reasons why one might not circular breathe. There are various ranges in the saxophone where it's easier to circular breathe, and various types of textures or material that it's easier to circular breathe over. And what you want to do is veer towards those so that it is the easiest situation for your saxophonist to play and circular breathe in a way that is successful. So for example, circular breathing on a tenor saxophone, mid-range, and this is with all saxophones, mid-range circular breathing is usually pretty easy. There was a little bit of undulation as I'm, you know, mechanically creating the circular breath, but in general, I can sit on that note for a long time. What I do is when I do have to cycle, just in case it's not a perfect cycle, which can obviously happen, I'll look for places where there's maybe other things going on in the texture that I can sort of hide underneath. And that's when I'll, you know, if there's some line in the guitar, I'll choose that point, which to sort of hide that cycle. So if you can do that in the orchestration, that's really helpful. Other ways that it's easier to circular breathe are very fast moving lines within the range of the horn. So and you get the idea. That can go on all day. And, you know, part of what makes that work is this: there's so much activity that you don't actually really pay attention to the mechanics of the air, which is, of course, where a lot of the risk that you'll have a shaky tone or something happen. Don't ask your player to circular breathe in the altissimo register because achieving those high partials is so dependent on the shape of the mouth internally. You put the saxophonist in a compromising situation when you ask them to circular breathe, because it takes such an alteration of the shape of the mouth in order to create the circular breath mechanism, that what happens is it typically pops down and cacks up there. So I'm playing like... Anyway, we don't need too many of those examples to realize that it's not going to be a successful thing. Circular breathing in the low register is typically hard unless you're subtoning, and this is also very player dependent. So I have a lot of experience subtoning and circular breathing on the low notes. For me, that is something I enjoy. Check in again with your player, because subtoning, which is a technique basically with a tongue on the reed to muffle the sound and create very, very soft dynamic in the low register, isn't always the easiest thing to circular breathe around. But here's an example of what that is. again, you still hear a little bit of the shaky or the undulation when I circular breathe, but a lot of times as a bass note, if I'm cycling a bass note like that underneath, a texture of 3 other instruments, it can provide a nice foundation harmonically, and you don't really notice a ton of the airiness of the changing of that sound. It's not as easy to play softly in the low register, so I choose to subtone most of the time, but you can hear the difference in tone. So this is without subtone. This is with. So you're getting a lot of that airy artifact, and the pitch is way softer. So the note is way softer. Like I said, I can circular on that with a subtone. But it's not so easy to circular without it. And that is just because the elongated mouth shape needed to play a low note on the horn without the subtone, basically it can't change, and so when I circular breathe, it changes it and pops up an octave. An alternative to circular breathing is to mark in places where your instrumentals can breathe. So try to phrase those naturally with the flow of the music. If you want a seamlessness through the whole ensemble, find places where it will go undetected. And then also you can indicate the size of the breath, snap breath. You can create moments in which the entire ensemble is phrasing and breathing within the saxophonist range. So those are things at your discretion, but if you don't decide where the saxophonist will breathe, they will find places. That's going to happen. So it's up to you whether or not you want to leave that up to your performer. Subtone, don't write a subtone above your notated written F4 in a saxophone range. And the reason for that is that it's not really a successful technique. If you're playing mid-range, if I put the tongue on the reed, it just creates a complication, and it doesn't really change the sound. If I want to change the sound like that, there are other ways I can do that with the lips. I can add air and airiness to the pitch without using a subtone. So sometimes I'll come across subtone written on notes above the F4, the higher stacks of the saxophone, and it doesn't really make sense to have it written up there. It's really a technique for the lower notes to muffle and change that sound down there. So in the mid to upper registers, if you want a softer dynamic, just write the soft dynamic, write triple piano, and we'll play it at the softest possible dynamic, and that will not be affected by the tongue on reed in those situations. So multiphonics. Here is my most excellent source for multiphonics that I can recommend. This is the Bärenreiter book from Marcus Weiss. It's very well written. The website includes audio examples that you'll see in the PDFs, concert pitches, you'll see transposed pitches, you'll see the fingerings, you'll see all sorts of different information. I want to see a multiphonic transposed so that I can see all the pitches that I'm going to be playing, and above that I want to see a fingering. If you use a resource for multiphonics, it's standardized to some degree, so I can then just reference that or look that up if I need to know like the concert pitches. So please include the fingering, otherwise I just have to go through that book and do it myself, which takes time, and it's right there for you. You also get an idea of the notes that are being played, the fingers that are being pushed down. So if you're going from some extremely full fingering for a multiphonic to a different combination that requires an alternation of the hand, you'll have an idea as to how practical that might be for the saxophonist. And again, ask. Choose multiphonics that work with your player. So the Bärenreiter book is generally a good place to start for me. I'm using all Selmer saxophones. I have a similar setup to the author of that book, and for the most part they work. However, check in. If you really want the character of that particular audio file or that particular multiphonic that you imagine, send it to me. I can work with you in the lesson, or we find alternatives. And that's the other thing, is that when working with multiphonics and working with composers, a lot of times we'll stumble upon things that actually get more of an effect that you want. So as I add keys on the saxophone, the notes get lower, and the air, comes out at different points along the way of the tube. When you have a multiphonic, what you're doing is playing strange combinations of fingers that result in keys being lifted along this path that wouldn't normally in order to play a straight up note. So basically, it's the instrument being broken in some way. For example, here's an E flat. If I lift my third finger, I get a multiphonic. And what happens is some pitch coming out here, there's some pitch coming out here, and it just modifies the horn to the point where you're going to get two or more pitches. So you can go crazy with multiphonics. There are a lot of them, and they're great. The multiphonics I love, especially in soft saxophone writing, are these closely packed dyads that you'll find, I think, number 22 in the Vice book. And sometimes the quality of these soft multiphonics, they're not the same. So I can play very clearly on a, but the multiphonic, there's more of an airy sound. It's just the nature of these multiphonics. Some multiphonics, it's possible to isolate partials within it. So that's just changing the mouth shape to sort of get an alternation. With some of the other multiphonics, even the louder ones, you can isolate. There's sometimes ways of isolating the bass note of a multiphonic. Bringing the rest of the pitches in, and usually that's over a crescendo kind of line. You can do the opposite though. Multiphonics are quite closely related to harmonics, except for harmonics are sort of achieved by the throat and the lip. So I don't change any fingerings on the instrument, but I am able to sort of isolate the partials as they go up. That's the low B flat on the horn. So that's like my lowest note. Some are harder than others, but check in. Anyway, and those again are easier to slide down. There's combinations of harmonics, so maybe you want sort of combination of the fundamental plus the first partial. Maybe you want the fifth in there. It just takes practice. Anyway. Microtones. Microtones are, quarter sharps, quarter flats, things in between. They're not so easy on wind instruments just because of the nature of the instrument. Obviously on a string instrument, you're able to just move slightly and they're all sort of mathematically separated just like all the rest of the pitches. But with wind instruments, because they're built to play Western music, I guess, in that sense, you have to come up with really creative fingerings to get the microtonal pitches to come out. So, and the thing I'm going to say about microtones, don't write a written G quarter sharp for any of the saxophones. It's not a microtone that has a found or usable fingering in general. Some horn players have had their instruments modified in order to do this. That's great. Mine aren't modified. So what I do for a G quarter sharp written is just kind of half press this one key, which is not an exacting science. It's not so easy. It's not like a clarinet where I can sort of like put my finger over the hole or something like that halfway. It's a hard pitch to play. Most other microtones are pretty simple. When you get to the low notes, so I think D quarter sharp is kind of the lowest. So you're looking at like a D for quarter sharp. And even that isn't quite a quarter tone, more like an eighth tone, but that's kind of the lowest you can get while still getting a microtone. And the fingerings get a little more complicated when you've got both hands. Up high in the range, microtones are a lot easier. Mid-range are no problem. So don't write in microtonal fingerings. The player will figure those out. And that has to do with there sort of not being a standard way that everybody wants to play their microtones. And unless you really know a specific fingering for that microtone, I would say let the player decide. Just give your players music early if you have a lot of microtones, because it means relearning the instrument in a lot of ways. Like, you know, they have to remap all these fingerings, and that takes a lot of shedding kind of practice. And if you're going to write in like a tablature kind of thing, again, that's the kind of material that just takes a long time to learn, because it's sort of a remapping. It's an entirely different way for the player to have to conceive of, you know, where these fingers normally go. So that would be appreciated. This is on saxophone, again, because I mentioned it's not like a clarinet where you've got open holes and you can sort of, I guess, gently remove or cover the hole with a finger. This is less tactile in that I'm playing keys that are attached to, you know, tone holes that have pads in them. So it's a matter of this pad coming down to seal off the note in a lot of cases. And so I guess any sort of nuance for glissando exists in my distance of this key sort of coming off gracefully or going on gracefully. So it's not as easy on the sax, is what I'm trying to say. Upper register is easier because what I do is use a lot of lip motion up and down, a lot of manipulation here in the mouth, and voicing in order to create the effect of glissando. Going a little bit slower over the course of glissando is usually a little bit easier. Up in the altissimo registers, so strangely enough, the place where you can't really do a lot of things, you can do a lot of glissando, and that's an easy place because there's just such a wealth of partials to sort of pull from before you kind of hit like an empty note. Glissandoing between 1 and 1-2 step type of stuff in the mid range is usually all right. So say I'm on a middle G. No problem. If it starts to become like, okay, let's see if we can get down a, you know, a whole minor third. Start to get little like bumps on the way. A whistle tone, the very, very high tones that you'll hear. Having the teeth directly on the reed, so most cases I'm playing with my teeth underneath my lip when it touches the bottom of the reed, and that is because there's air that comes out in different places when this reed is vibrated with the teeth on it that create these really, really high tones, and they're very inexact, so please don't write exact pitch lines for whistle tones. It's more of an effect. I use it in a texture. They get wider if I'm using other techniques with them. I can do a straight teeth on reed. Sort of limiting the amount of artifact, or I can add a lot of artifact. I can create variation in the pitch. I can use a little bit of the lower sac or the lower area of the horn. So you get all sorts of cool textures, and those are things you can really easily combine with other instruments. Whistle tones, you're going to want to notate something like this. The idea of whether they're active or still. You're going to want to indicate the dynamic you want them at. There is variation in dynamic with whistle tones. So notate what dynamic you want. I get questions about split tones sometimes. There's not really a split tone thing on woodwind instruments. It's different than the mechanical way that brass players do split tones. But there are a couple things I can do. I can underblow a high pitch, so things like that. That's more of a underblow. I'm not vibrating my lips at different speeds, but I'm more finding a place between the high pitch, which I'm still getting part of, and this lower partial. So it's more like a multiphonic effect, but has a slightly different way I would approach it. Another thing you can do is the sax players create two pitches at once by playing one, singing one. There I'm singing a fifth. I can sing a little louder than I play, or vice versa. A lot of times I like to use the singing as sort of a decoration of that pitch, finding that sort of hybrid place where it creates a unique effect. So you've got the vibrating fifth and fundamental there, and they have a nice way of working together. It's consonant intervals they're easier to pick out, so a lot of times it's not what the composer imagines. It's not this sort of equal chord between the voice and the instrument. It's more like a kind of effect, and in a large texture with a lot of things going on, it's even harder to sort of hear that pitch, balance it out, and play. But check in with your player about what you want when it comes to singing and playing. So you can play with every different interval, and they each kind of vibrate differently with a bass note. One thing I really like to do with singing is gliss up the sung pitch, or gliss down the sung pitch, or alternatively gliss down the saxophone note or gliss it up and keep the singing pitch the same. So keep one sort of control and the other is sort of this moving variable. Here's an example of glissing the sung pitch. And then here's an example of sort of glissing the sax pitch. So some ideas. The air sound. Now, again, akin to something like whistle tones or slaps, you've got a lot of instruments around you that have various different sounds, and the air sounds are a great way to provide a unique timbre from an instrument that might normally be thought of as sort of a melody instrument. So imagine every way you could possibly write a note it's the same thing you can do with air. So I can close holes to create lower air, which causes the air to go through the horn, come out down here. I can release air. I can use the mouthpiece and reed sort of as an amplifier for air at this level and create sort of a high frequency white noise. Mouth shape, how the air comes out, the syllable a phonetic syllable that I'm kind of playing with, that can all alter the air and change it up. And at the same time, I can also play with the different fingerings on the horn. So you're getting air out here, you're getting sort of spatial quality of the shifting of the movement of the air. There's a lot of energy in that sound to begin with, and then you move it around on the instrument, or you create different shapes and sounds up here, and it just adds the intensity of the overall effect. I like to notate air sounds typically like this. You know, square note head is becoming a little bit more standard for air, especially the wind instruments. I'll indicate, you know, where you want the air to come out. If it's an open C sharp, that just basically means I'm not playing any keys. If you want the mouth to be slightly open while I do that, you're going to get a different sound. If you want some of it to happen here, some of it to go through. The other option is to have a little bit of pitch in the air sound, or vice versa. I can play half air, half pitched, and that's notated sort of the diagonal line through the square note head, and contrasting colors white and black to indicate the division of the sounds. You might also even put like a ratio. Try not to over-notate, but if there's a very specific sound you're after that's like mostly air with just this very hint of pitch, you might want something like that. So say it, because a half and half note head, I would probably play more like. Again, some of the normal techniques that you might associate with saxophone, articulation, things like that, could all be played with air sounds too. So that's a double tongue kind of thing with air. Here's a flutter. I guess just to talk a little bit about those techniques too as regular techniques. So flutter tongue, similar to other wind instruments such as flute, clarinet. Use 3 slashes on the stem of the note to indicate that. With an FL above, use it like a trill line. You could also use a growl. Growl just means I'm activating the vocal cords a little bit with a guttural sort of sound and adding that to the pitch. That's a great loud sort of technique. Double tonguing, again, check with your player. Single tonguing max is about quarter equals 120 for 4/16 notes, and that's just a general across the board for players. Some players can tongue quicker than others, single tongue quicker, and others might be comfortable double tonguing, others might not be. So repeated note, single tongue is a little bit easier than moving. That's a single tongue. Double tonguing, we're just creating a t-ka, t-ka. It might not be as smooth. I would say use it, for my preference, for me, use it sparingly. And I kind of think of it more as an effect. It's sort of like halfway between a single tongue and a trill, or a single tongue and like a flutter growl type thing. So there's some cool things you can do with that. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on with saxophone technique is different types of attacks. So you've got your staccato, your legato. These are tongue attacks, accented. And of course every variation of accent with regards to, you know, aggression at the beginning. And then you've got slap. Slap tongue is just a more percussive attack at the beginning of the note. Slaps can be pitched, as you just heard, or they can be kind of, there's the idea of the open slap that sort of, so you don't have the exact same sort of tuned pitch as a closed slap. Articulating slap pitches many in a row, trying to go sort of above a quarter equals 80. It's just harder to get the tongue mechanism going at that speed. It sort of needs a little bit of recovery time. And it also wears out quicker. So, you know, doing a ton of slapping in a row is a very tiring thing for the tongue. And is just like double toning. A player will work up to it and practice it, but know that there's a limit to that. So those are just some techniques for the saxophone, just broadly. I just want to talk a little bit about writing in the Hypercube scenario. So some of the techniques I like, or I can imagine, a composer sort of approaching our ensemble with is sort of timbral ideas and ways to use the saxophone in this quartet of just so many different sounds. So it can feel a little overwhelming at first, but I think if you approach it with the idea of there being sort of one central sound and coming up with ideas of decoration or concepts of there being two instruments that are doing the same function. Things like matching timbres between the high electric guitar pitches and the saxophone, high pitches on the soprano or something, also high pitches on the accordion. So Andrea, the high pitches up there. The world of those three sounds are very complementary, and you get a little bit of, the effect of the guitar with the electric sound, but in that same pitch world, and then the accordion with sort of this, it's almost a mechanical kind of sounding upper register, and add the sort of purity of the saxophone to that, and the saxophone works off of the electric and this sort of mechanical world and falls into it, and it sounds like one hybrid sound. So quick running lines with the electric guitar, that goes for the piano too. Saxophone is very good at writing lyrical passages, quick, virtuosic, running up, running down, and pairing that with another instrument, especially an instrument that you wouldn't normally hear it paired with, can be really effective. So you're getting the combination of articulation between the two instruments, and the idea doesn't necessarily have to be match, exact. When you have different sounds and different articulations, sometimes you get something interesting. So think about that a little bit when you're writing, and how you might pair instruments up using 2, using 3, and having them all complete the same function but with this sort of combinatorial sound. The idea of slap tongues with the wood block. So anytime, we all know the sound of a wood block, and imagine pairing at the exact moment, so rhythmically right to a line with something else percussive going on, and maybe there's also like a muted string in the piano on a low note. You can sort of play off of multiple different instruments, that effect happening in different positions on a stage, and the sounds are very similar, but they're just different enough that you're hearing something that's not quite, it's sort of greater than the sum of its parts, if that makes sense. Air noise with the percussion, so there's sort of the brushing of a large bass drum, cymbal bowing, things like that have shimmer to them, that have sort of unpitched or non-pitched artifact in the instrument that the saxophone can blend with a bowed cymbal going up. What it does is it creates almost an amplifying effect for something going on in the percussion. So there's a way to use that, without amplifying the percussion itself and adding a bunch of filters. I'm doing that over here on a wind instrument. So there's a way to capitalize on that ability. Multiphonic blends with bowed cymbal, that too, where you oftentimes when you're bowing a cymbal, you're getting a bouquet of partials that are either you're aware that those ones are going to come out, or you're getting a different set depending on sort of where the percussion is holding or touching the cymbal. As a saxophonist, there's a ton of multiphonics I can play to either complement, to match, or to in some ways play off of what the percussionist's resultant partial spectrum is on something like a bowed cymbal. So matching those at similar dynamics, or even having sort of gestural increase and decrease in dynamic to create like phasing and pulsating is also very nice in that case. The idea of power chords in the piano, multiphonic hits with those power chords, just enough to alter the sound of the piano chords. You create an interesting group of pitches down there. It's not just the same piano chord you've heard 10,000 times in 20th century music, but it's like you've got now something else. There's something else in there, and then what that is a multiphonic playing it almost that dynamic a little bit slightly under, and in a sort of complementary supportive way. You can think of that as sort of a thing across the board. The instrument can be used as a foreground or as a background instrument, and all of the instruments can. So what are the functions of what we're doing? Is Jay's line on guitar here the primary line, and what I am is a decoration of it. So I'll play my dynamic and my style accordingly in order to make that line as successful as it can be. Sometimes you can point those out to us, dynamically notating that. Typically, in the Hypercube scenario, we do want to still leave nuance for orchestration and for hierarchy at times. But if you want all of the instruments to be playing the same dynamic and the same level, just notate it, and we'll deal with the discrepancy between the natural balance of those instruments. So, like a snare drum at forte is going to be so super loud that you could possibly lose some middling range and flutter note on the saxophone. We will compensate for that and figure those things out in Ensemble. Whereas if you want the saxophone to be a supportive role to a snare drum role, or you want the snare drum to be a supportive role to the saxophone note, then you can change the dynamics. So in one case, you're writing both at forte. The other, you're going to change the dynamic between the two instruments in order to get the effect you want. So just be, I guess, deliberate about it, if that makes sense. Another great thing is to bend tones. We talked about glissing, bending pitches with the guitar. So the guitar's got the ability to slide through pitches, the ability to use a whammy bar and to change pitch, alter it, and so does the saxophone. And sometimes when you've got those two things happening, you can play with the rate, the range of the gliss, and dynamic and sound. So you're getting a lot out of something like that, which is another thing I like to see. Flutter tongue with guitar tremolo, with sort of any accordion note, with trill in the piano. Things that are decorative go well together. It's also nice when one is decorative and one is not. So think about those types of ways to match timbre and blend sounds. There are also things like triggers, which is another way to think of orchestrating a line where the sort of the central focus is this gesture, and how do we get from A to B? How do we get from left to right? Well, if the sound starts off with sort of big slap, like a hit in the percussion and piano, that the saxophone sort of fades into a multiphonic on. So it's perceived as one gesture, even though multiple instruments are creating it together. So you get a hit here, followed by a sustain of some sort, maybe followed by another addition of an instrument, and like a pulsation for a little while, and then an instant cut off or something like that. But you're basically planning out the gesture and then filling in the portions with different events. So the trigger is a great effect. The saxophone is really great dynamically. So I think one of the best qualities about the instrument is just the incredible dynamic range that it has. We have the ability to play so soft, almost at like the very edge of perception, to peek out all of these microphones, and to have that type of dynamic contrast is something to really take advantage of in this situation. We've got the piano that can also play very soft. You've got certain instruments in the percussion that can be very soft. The electric guitar can play at any volume. And then you've also got the ceilings of all of those instruments, which is really high. So don't be afraid to use the saxophone, the full dynamic range. And the other great thing about the saxophone is the ability to create sharp attacks, to have the ability to have short sounds like that, but also to sustain. So I don't have to use a pedal. I mean, there's not like a natural decay to every note I play. As long as my breath is supporting, I have the ability to play this note, in case of circuit breathing, as long as I want. So having, as I pointed out before, a gesture. And sort of all in the same phrase. You can also create any sort of envelope decay. Just the ability to hold through those, to be able to play and to pulse in and out of texture is also a really great quality of the instrument. So think about those things as you're writing. And if you have any questions, there is a forum where there are some resources posted. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you for watching, and feel free to follow up with any questions.